we have Nat McCully, who, it's funny, I haven't seen in a long time, but we actually used to work together years gone by at Adobe back in the day. And when I was product manager for fonts and typography, Nat was in charge of engineering the Japanese version of InDesign. And Nat is one of maybe two people I know in the world who know the most about sort of the intricate technical details of CJK layout from his time first at Claris and then Apple, long time at Adobe, including developing what was then a fairly radical idea of, hey, we're going to make a Japanese-specific version of this app that has a ton of Japanese-specific features, yada, yada. But I will leave it at that. Back then, neither of us had gray hair, by the way.
Thanks for that. Yes, hello everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm going to talk a little bit about text layout engines because that's my area of expertise, and in particular the challenges that we have when fonts evolve in new directions. I'm a principal scientist with the Adobe Type team, and my academic background is in Japanese art history and Japanese language, and combining that with computer science allowed me to find work in a field where linguistic expression and design and culture intersects with technology. Fonts and type were always one of my passions, and so when I joined Adobe in late 1998, I began a journey that continues to this day in dreaming up and then implementing new and better ways to support the world's languages in as high a quality as manner as possible. I lead the team that develops the Adobe Type text engine, which is the layout engine in many of our creative products. I work with the Adobe Fonts team, which is not only a font service, but is also a foundry. And so I'm lucky to have as colleagues some of the most talented type designers in the world. And I feel very fortunate talking to all of you expert type designers as well. And speaking of those designers, they do come up with some amazing stuff. As many of you know, creating a new font is more than just creating a new typeface design. Fonts, being programs, are invoked inside a layout engine, and the two cooperate to put glyphs on the screen in the way that best communicates an author's intent. Sometimes font formats or font tools are somewhat limited in how they work, and so to accomplish something new, sometimes font developers have to bend the machinery of type to suit their need. Adobe Type is Adobe's font foundry, and we recently announced a new innovative typeface called Momochidori. This is a sample introducing it. And this sample shows how Momochidori is designed to morph its glyphs to fit within a given space perfectly and to support both horizontal and vertical writing. Both the weight and the width are variable. The ability to morph the normally square glyphs so they fit within a given space is inspired by traditional sign painting, where the letterer would paint the letters so they fit in the space and stood out to the reader. When sign production began using fonts, this practice began to be lost, but it remains a very special feature of the language that such variation can occur. Today, one still sees examples of non-square typography in signage, but the special nature of hand-painted signage and lettering is difficult to achieve without variable font technology and the new techniques introduced with Momochidori. This sample was entirely done using Momochidori and rather faithfully reproduces the feeling of that classical hand-painted look. This font is still under development and will be released later this year, together with new versions of Adobe design products that support its full functionality. Fonts like Momochidori push the boundaries of digital typography for Japanese. But before I get into how, I would like to give you some background as to the current state of the art of digital typography for Asian languages that are being disrupted by this font. Digital fonts are created in a design space with a coordinate system called units per m, or UPM. Latin glyphs are normally placed in this design space with the Roman baseline at coordinate system origin 0, 0. Key font metrics like the Roman baseline, the X height, the cap height, the ascent, and the descent are all defined in terms of these coordinates. They normally correlate with the sizes of the glyphs and their escapement, and this is fine when we're talking about Latin-based typography, which is horizontally written and aligned to the Roman baseline. But what about other writing systems that do not use the Roman baseline as the key reference point across fonts? This is what happens when different East Asian fonts disagree about where to place their ideographic glyphs in the design space relative to that Roman baseline origin. Because each font has a different design and optimum size for their Latin glyphs, it follows that the Roman baseline would end up all over the place. But this causes problems when setting type according to the CJK inbox. When Adobe was developing the first Japanese PostScript fonts with the foundry Morisawa, PostScript only supported Latin-based typography and limited Latin-based font metrics. The developers knew that there would be a problem aligning the inboxes if there was no agreement about where to place the glyph origin, so they fairly arbitrarily decided to place it at 120 units inside the inbox on all of their Japanese fonts. The inbox is made equal to the point size. The Roman baseline being set 120 units into the inbox basically forced the Latin glyphs to be a certain relative size to the inbox, because normally the cap height is centered in that inbox height when setting mixed Japanese and Latin on the same line. So this de facto standard allowed the inbox to remain consistent relative to the glyph origin, but it made Latin glyph component of the Japanese fonts relatively large at the same point size as Latin fonts. And it also made for little variation in Latin glyph sizes between different Japanese fonts. As you can see, these different fonts all align to their inboxes to the 120:880 ratio, but their Latin glyphs are very similar in size. This is Kozuka Mincho, Adobe's Kozuka Mincho, which you can see is the archetypical 120:880 Roman baseline font design. But what about if other foundries want to have more freedom? What would they do? In this font, FontWorks decided to favor the CJK inbox, but at the same time made larger Latin glyphs. But this resulted in compromising the Latin glyph placement so they leak below the origin. For Hiragi no Mincho, Apple and Dainippon Screen wanted a higher baseline for their Latin glyphs relative to the CJK inbox, but this makes them float above the baseline of other fonts. This Korean font wanted a much smaller ratio of Latin glyph to inbox height, but this made the Latin float high above the ordinary baseline. And on the other extreme, this Korean font's Latin glyphs are nearly the same height as the Hangul glyphs. So their baseline is far lower than the origin point, and thus they are lower than the Latin font's baseline. This is the Korean font with its various metrics. As you can see, no attention is paid to setting the Latin metrics that correspond to the Latin glyphs. The X height and the cap height are completely arbitrary. The origin is not set on the Roman baseline, but rather so the Hangul glyphs will lie 200 units into the inbox and 800 units above it. This 800-200 ratio appears to be a similar pseudo-standard to help the Hangul glyphs align across fonts. The other choice that some font makers make is to bias to the Latin system, but bend it so that it somewhat supports mixed typography. The Latin metrics in Roman baseline are set to match the Latin glyphs in the font, and the CJK glyphs are placed and sized to harmonize with those Latin glyphs. A consequence of this is the Latin glyphs aligned to the Roman baseline as with other Latin fonts, but the CJK inbox is not aligned with the de facto 120:880 standard set by Adobe and Morisawa, so you get compatibility with one system, but not the other. So how do applications deal with this incompatibility? You can't have both Latin layout and CJK layout at the same time and have any degree of freedom, design freedom in your font that supports these different script systems. Either the Latin metrics take precedence or the CJK inbox will take precedence, but not both, and not without significant compromise. So in 1999, Adobe introduced the concept of the CJK inbox typography as a first-class citizen existing alongside the original Latin-based Roman baseline system. And to achieve the above layout in InDesign for all fonts, we introduced a heuristic to calculate each font's CJK inbox, including a virtual one for non-CJK fonts. We also introduced a mode in the text engine to switch between Latin-based and CJK inbox-based line placement. Using heuristics in the layout engine, however, is fragile. And really such information should be included in the font itself, even if that font lacks CJK glyphs. It is much better if the font designer tells us how they want the glyphs they design to be set in a CJK mbox-based line. Having established the first-class CJK mbox system, we then introduced a new CJK mbox metrics to the OpenType spec in the form of a set of base table entries corresponding to the upper and lower bounds of the CJK metrics for both horizontal and vertical writing modes. You can see here the base table entries IDEO, IDEO, and IDTP, which allow fonts and layout engines to support either Latin-based ascent-descent baseline typography, as in the past, or CJK mbox-based typography in these new entries. Until the base table ideographic mbox existed, font designers had two choices for setting up the various font metrics. They could favor Latin or favor CJK. Favoring Latin meant you would set the baseline on the Latin glyphs and then place the square mbox relative to those Latin glyphs. And you might also set the OS2 S-typo ascender and descender to the line height to match a popular use case like some UI label or other thing that you used in your testing. Notice that the OS2 entries in this font are still set to the CJK mbox and not to Latin metrics. The G sticks down below the descent entry, and this is a compromise for backwards compatibility, even though the font also contains the new base table entries. Supporting mbox-based typography in vertical text involves not only a vertical line, but several considerations are needed to be made by the layout engine to support all fonts correctly. In vertical text, the conventions adopted for horizontal mbox line metrics are simply rotated 90 degrees, so the glyphs in the line advance downwards, and the Latin glyphs are also rotated in the line. The CJK glyphs are, of course, upright and generally centered in the line's mbox. This font, as I mentioned, sizes the Latin glyphs such that they must be positioned slightly below the line baseline origin, but the CJK glyphs will align with the other CJK fonts if the same origin is used for their respective mboxes. As you can see, there are both upright glyphs and rotated glyphs in the line. This implies a mix of upright mboxes, where the height is vertical, and rotated mboxes, where the height is horizontal. This is no big deal when the mbox is square, because they're the same. But what if the CJK mbox is not square? This font, Mikaze, is an example of a non-square Japanese font. The mbox is 750 units wide versus 1,000 units tall, although the font contains vertical metrics that allow for vertical offsets in positioning the glyphs within their escapement. There is no information in the font to specify an upright glyph's horizontal placement. By convention, upright glyphs that are narrower than the mbox height are centered within that height. Furthermore, this font being condensed should really be considered horizontal only because of how it maintains a tall aspect ratio in all orientations, which in vertical text conflicts with the rotated Latin glyphs. Looking at the font metrics, we can see that there is no IDTP included for either axis, so the layout engine extrapolates them at 880 units above the Roman baseline. There is an ROMN baseline entry for vertical and for horizontal for the Roman baseline, and that's the typical 120 units from the mbox bottom, so it is compatible with the Adobe Mortisaw standard mbox placement. So with the previous information in mind, let's examine the new Momochidori variable font. It introduces some new behaviors that caused us to rethink certain assumptions about CJK mbox typography and pushes the envelope of existing font metrics conventions even further. In addition to the weight axis, Momochidori is the first Japanese variable font that incorporates a width axis, and the width axis operates in a unique way that for the first time supports both horizontal and vertical writing modes, while preserving its visual size. One other thing to notice is the way the transformation between instances is happening at the Roman baseline origin, not at something more compatible with mbox typography like the center. This is another limitation of the Latin-centric nature of digital font development and the way that most applications render text. Another problem with only varying the width of a Japanese font has to do with the visual size of the glyphs. In a given point size, varying only the width causes the overall area of the glyph to change too much, and as a result, the visual size seems to change. In the line above, the narrow instance seems smaller than the square instance, and the wide instance seems larger. In the line below, by varying both width and height at the same time, the visual size appears not to change very much and stays consistent across instances. Japanese fonts that are square are able to support vertical and horizontal writing with no problems, but non-square fonts, on the other hand, have problems when used in vertical writing due to the conflicting directions of Latin rotated glyphs and upright Japanese glyphs, where the non-square M-boxes are in different orientations in the line. These examples show different combinations of condensed and extended fonts with scaling applied or not. Without any intervention on the horizontal condensed font, you would get line A in vertical layout. All the glyphs are taller than they are wide, but the tallness goes in different directions in the vertical line due to the mixed orientations. Actually, what is correct for the condensed font in vertical is line B. To get line B, however, requires the font and the layout engine to cooperate and switch out condensed for extended in the upright glyphs and rotating the condensed Latin glyphs. Momochidori, with its width axis that changes both M-box width and height, combined with logic that switches out the direction of condensed or wide to match the line direction, achieves true direction-agnostic, non-square CJK font M-box layout for the first time. See how the condensed line is also condensed when laid out vertically. Same with the wide instance. Even though the Japanese and Latin glyphs are differently oriented, the font correctly applies the transformation, so they are aligned. Line height using CJK M-box metrics was based on the point size of the runs when all CJK fonts were square and used a consistent M-box. Now that a font can change its CJK M-box independently of the font size, one must consider what would be correct for layout engines to do. When a font's M-box changes according to the variable font axis, assumptions about line height being equal to the point size now are called into question. Here, each run in this square font example is aligned to the M-box center, which is a feature in the layout engine using M-box height calculations to place the glyphs. The largest point size run sets the metrics of the line, and all the runs align to those line metrics. The height and also its box of the largest run and the Latin metric offsets are used for all the character alignment. When the line height is fixed and the font's M-box variable, the largest size run will not necessarily be the tallest M-box in the line. Here, the 100-point run is largest, so the line height is set to 100 points. However, the 99-point run next to it, their M-box is actually 113 points high and sticks out of the line height as shown here. Conversely, in certain cases, the largest run's M-box may be shorter than the point size, as the case above. The largest run is 115 points, but its M-box is only 100 points. The character alignment is set to M-box center, so the layout engine has to calculate the height differences, so all the run's M-boxes are centered in the line height. Also, the various metric offsets into the M-box set into the line should be taken, since this line is point size based, from the square instance M-box, which is also point size based. That way, all the other square runs will be more compatible with those offsets. So maybe assuming the line height is always equal to the point size is not the best idea when M-boxes are different heights. What about using the M-box height as the line height regardless of the point size? Here, the line height simply takes the tallest M-box and aligns all the other runs to it. This seems simple enough, but what does it do to the leading calculation? Leading is also measured in points, and automatic leading is a function of the largest point size in the line. All of the text in the two lines above are 100 points, and the auto leading is 150%, which is 150 points. So in Japanese M-box-based leading, line leading is the distance from the top of the current line's M-box to the top of the next line's M-box, backwards from Latin-based leading. This convention is taken from the traditional Japanese photo typesetting practice and is an additional mode in Adobe layout engines to the standard Latin baseline to baseline upward leading model. Depending on the setting of the width axis in each run, the line gap will vary widely even though the point size hasn't changed. So this would be new behavior caused by the font's M-box no longer being tied to the point size. Variable M-box typography is really a new world. Now, CJK M-box layout becomes somewhat similar to Latin line layout in that the ink of each font's glyphs is not necessarily consistent relative to the point size. In addition, new concepts such as how line height and leading is calculated are introduced. All of this depends on fonts including robust font metrics for each script system they support, Latin metrics for the Latin glyphs, and Japanese metrics for the Japanese glyphs, for example. The engines must now support several layout conventions if they are to have the best quality results, similar to traditional typesetting in each language. Thank you for listening. And one last note, I'd like to hear if you ever think about how to use layout engines with your font creations, and if you envision bumping up against the technical limitations of font formats or typographic conventions, as we do with Momochidori. Also, we're working on various new ways to improve multilingual typesetting and would like to talk to you if you know about non-Latin typography and can tell us your experiences. So please see me or anyone at that table over there who can talk to you during the breaks. Thanks.
So thanks so much, Nat. Although, of course, we started a bit late, we can take just a minute or two for questions, if there are any questions on Nat's talk. One thing that I'm so any questions from the audience? I have one if no one else does. Yes. Some more. Dominique, can I get a mic over there?
Hello. I think we met yesterday, and
yes.
I'm wondering. So, do we need to add add the vertical open type feature to all characters for the typeface?
You have two choices. One is to add, if you want to switch the aspect ratio of the upright characters, those are accessed with the vert feature. It's true. So you will need to have twice as many CJK glyphs in your font to support it that way. The other way is to rotate the Latin characters and rotate them, or switch their aspect ratio. That's a lesser supported feature, but there is an open type feature that has a vertical alternate for rotated Latin, VRTR, I believe it's called. And so you can use either of those. However, vert is more supported more widely in layout engines.
I think my question is mostly about talking about the condensed Chinese and when you do make the vertical.
Right. So if you want to change from condensed horizontally, which is taller, to condensed vertically, which is wider, that's what I'm talking about, is you would switch them. There is another problem in that when developing a variable font, you have different masters. And so you have a master for each of the extremes. And for Momochidori, we had 4 masters for thin, wide, thin, narrow, wide, heavy, wide, and high, heavy, narrow. And the design space of the horizontal wide is 750 units tall. In vertical narrow, that has to be transformed to 1,000 units by 13 by 1130. So your UPM needs to be switched, and your font tooling doesn't support any of that, so you have to do some creative stuff behind the scenes to allow for production of these fonts in any real way. And so that's one thing that we're going to be talking to Glyphs about and advising, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Nat.